The hammer came down at Fort Benson on a Tuesday morning in 1868, and when it did, a man named Jacob Cord became the owner of another human being for the price of $42 and a skinning knife. The woman standing on that platform had eyes that didn't beg, and that's what bothered every man watching. They wanted her broken. Before we continue, subscribe and comment where you're watching from. Jacob Cord stood at the back of the crowd with his hat pulled low and his rifle across his shoulders. He had ridden 3 days from the Montana territories with no intention of attending a slave auction. He had come to Fort Benson to sell pelts and buy ammunition. He had come because winter was closing in, and a man alone in the high country needed supplies more than he needed a conscience. But when he saw the woman on the platform, he stopped walking. Not because she was beautiful. Beauty didn't survive long on the frontier. He stopped because of the way she stood. Her wrists were bound with hemp rope. Her dress was torn canvas sacking. Her feet were bare on the wooden planks. But she stood like she was carved from the same stone as the mountains behind her. The auctioneer was a fat man named Hutchins who ran most of the illegal trade through the fort. He worked for a syndicate that purchased captives from rogue bands and sold them to miners, ranchers, and men with enough coin to avoid questions. The military looked the other way. The territorial government pretended not to know. And the men who attended these auctions told themselves they were rescuing these women from worse fates. Jacob knew better. He had seen enough of the frontier to know that every man convinced himself his particular sin was mercy. Hutchins called her Blackfoot, though Jacob doubted the auctioneer knew a Blackfoot from a Shoshone. She could have been Crow. She could have been Northern Cheyenne. Her features were sharp and her skin was darker than the prairie dust. Her hair had been cut short, probably to strip away identity, probably to make her less valuable if she ran. Bidding started at $20. A rancher from the southern settlements raised his hand. A miner with California gold offered $30. A freight operator who ran supply lines to the logging camps went to $35. Each bid brought a murmur from the crowd. Each man who raised his hand did so with the casual certainty of someone purchasing livestock. Jacob watched the woman's face. She did not look at the bidders. She looked past them, toward the tree line beyond the fort walls, toward the mountains that rose like broken teeth against the sky. He had seen that look before. On soldiers who knew they were dying. On animals caught in steel traps. It was the look of someone deciding whether to fight or surrender. The bidding reached $40. Jacob didn't plan to raise his hand. He had no use for a slave. He had no use for company. He lived in a one-room cabin 12 miles from the nearest settlement, and he preferred it that way. He had spent the last 6 years avoiding people, avoiding questions, avoiding the weight of what he had done during the war and what he had continued doing after it ended. But he raised his hand anyway. Hutchins spotted him immediately. The auctioneer's eyes narrowed, calculating. Jacob was known at the fort. Not by name, but by reputation. He was the man who brought in wolf pelts when everyone else said the wolves were gone. He was the man who survived winters that killed smarter men. He was the man you didn't cheat, because the last trader who tried had disappeared on the trail back to Helena. Hutchins called 42. No one countered. Jacob added the knife to sweeten the deal. It was a good blade, 8 inches, bone handle, sharp enough to feel dress an elk in under 20 minutes. He had taken it off a dead man 3 years prior. The dead man had tried to rob him on the Jefferson River Trail. Jacob had been faster. Hutchins accepted. The transaction took less than a minute. Money changed hands. A bill of sale was written on scrap paper and signed by a man who could barely write his own name. The document meant nothing in any legal sense, but it meant everything in the world these men operated in. It meant Jacob Cord now owned a human being, and anyone who interfered would be violating property rights, which mattered more than any other kind. Jacob approached the platform. The woman watched him now. Her eyes were dark brown, almost black, and they didn't flinch. Hutchins cut the ropes on her wrists with Jacob's new knife. then handed the blade back with a grin that showed 3 missing teeth. Jacob took the woman by the arm. Not rough, but firm enough that the crowd would see it as possession. He led her through the mud and the horse dung and the watching eyes. No one spoke to him. No one asked questions. A man's purchase was his own business. He brought her to his horse, a gray gelding named River, who had carried him through 5 territories and never spooked at gunfire. He boosted her up into the saddle, then climbed up behind her. The woman sat rigid, her spine straight, her hands gripping the saddle horn. Jacob turned the horse toward the gate. The guards waved him through without a word. Behind him, the auction continued. Hutchins was already calling for bids on a Paiute boy who couldn't have been older than 12. They rode north. Jacob didn't speak. The woman didn't ask where they were going. The mountains grew larger as they traveled, the peaks white with early snow, the valleys turning gold and red with autumn. They followed a game trail that cut through lodgepole pine and Douglas fir, climbing steadily away from the fort, away from the settlements, away from the world of men who bought and sold other people before breakfast. By nightfall, they were 15 miles into the wilderness. Jacob made camp in a clearing near a creek. He unsaddled River and hobbled him where the grass was good. He built a small fire using dry pine and a striker. He set a pot of water to boil and added jerky and hardtack to make a thin stew. The woman sat on the far side of the fire, watching him with the same unreadable expression she had worn on the platform. He handed her a tin cup of stew. She took it without acknowledgement. She drank it slowly, methodically, like someone who had learned not to waste food. Jacob ate in silence. The fire cracked and popped. Somewhere in the trees, an owl called. The temperature was dropping fast, the way it did in the high country once the sun went down. He pulled a blanket from his pack and tossed it to her. She caught it, studied it, then wrapped it around her shoulders. Jacob settled against his saddle and pulled his hat over his eyes. He kept his rifle across his lap, his hand near the trigger. Not because he thought she would attack him. Because he knew that men like Hutchins didn't let valuable property leave without considering whether to take it back. The woman did not sleep. He could tell by the sound of her breathing, slow and controlled, the breathing of someone keeping watch. He didn't sleep much either. The next morning, he kicked dirt over the fire and saddled River before the sun cleared the ridge. The woman was already standing, the blanket folded neatly and placed on a rock. She moved with efficiency, no wasted motion, the kind of precision you only learn through survival. They rode west. Jacob chose trails that avoided settlements and wagon roads. He stopped twice to let River drink from mountain streams. He chewed dried venison as they traveled and offered some to the woman. She accepted it without looking at him. By the 3rd day, they reached Jacob's cabin. It sat in a valley ringed by spruce and aspen, a single-room structure built from chinked logs with a sod roof and a stone chimney. A small corral held firewood and trapping supplies. A smokehouse stood 20 yards away, half full of cured meat. A root cellar was dug into the hillside, stocked with potatoes and turnips and preserves. It was a hard place, isolated, built for one man to survive alone. Jacob dismounted and gestured for the woman to follow. She slid from the saddle and stood in the clearing, taking in the cabin, the trees, the mountains beyond. He opened the door and stepped inside. The interior was dim and cold, the air smelling of wood smoke and animal hides. A narrow bed stood against one wall. A table and 2 chairs occupied the center. Shelves held tins of coffee, salt, flour, and ammunition. Traps hung from pegs near the door. A Winchester rifle rested above the fireplace. Jacob lit a lantern and set it on the table. He turned to the woman, who had followed him inside and now stood just past the threshold, her eyes adjusting to the darkness. He pointed to the bed. She looked at it, then at him. Jacob shook his head. He gestured to the corner near the fireplace where a pile of furs and blankets lay stacked. He dragged them toward the opposite wall and arranged them into a makeshift pallet, The woman watched but did not move. Jacob stepped back, creating distance. He sat at the table and began cleaning his rifle, a task that required focus and gave her space to decide what to do next. After a long moment, the woman walked to the pallet and sat down. She pulled one of the blankets over her shoulders and stared at the wall. Jacob finished with the rifle and hung it back above the fireplace. He added wood to the stove and set a pot of coffee to brew. The cabin warmed slowly. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the smell of coming snow. He poured 2 cups of coffee and set one on the floor near the woman's pallet. She looked at it but didn't reach for it. Jacob drank his own cup standing by the window, watching the tree line. He had lived alone long enough to know the rhythms of the forest. He knew when animals moved and when they didn't. He knew the sound of wind through pine versus the sound of someone trying to move quietly through underbrush. Nothing moved out there now except the wind. He turned back to the woman. She had picked up the coffee and was holding it with both hands, letting the heat seep into her fingers. Jacob sat at the table and spoke for the first time since leaving the fort. He told her she could leave whenever she wanted. He told her the nearest Crow village was 2 days south, the nearest Blackfoot camp 3 days northwest. He told her he would not stop her, would not follow her, would not report her to anyone. The woman stared at him while he spoke. Her expression didn't change. When he finished, she set the coffee down and lay on the pallet, turning her back to him. Jacob blew out the lantern and lay on his own bed, fully clothed, his revolver under his pillow. The woman did not leave that night, or the next, or the one after that. Winter arrived early, the first snow falling in heavy curtains that buried the valley under 2 feet of white. The cold came down from Canada like a living thing, seeping through the walls, turning breath to fog, freezing water in the bucket overnight. Jacob fell into the rhythms of winter survival. He checked his trap lines every 3 days, pulling marten and beaver from steel jaws, resetting traps in new locations when the old ones stopped producing. He chopped firewood until his shoulders ached. He hunted elk in the high meadows and hauled meat back to the cabin on a Travoy River dragged through the snow. The woman worked without being asked. She scraped hides and stretched them on frames. She mended Jacob's clothing with sinew and bone needles she fashioned herself. She made pemmican from dried meat and berries Jacob didn't know he had. She moved through the cabin like smoke, efficient and silent, never in his way, never expecting conversation. Jacob didn't know what to make of her. He had purchased her with the vague idea of setting her free once they were far enough from the fort. But freedom in winter was a death sentence. The mountain passes were already snowed in. The valleys were patrolled by desperate animals and desperate men. A woman alone would last 3 days at most. So she stayed, and he let her. And the winter deepened. One night in December, Jacob woke to find her standing at the window, silhouetted against the moonlight reflecting off snow. She was looking south, toward the direction they had come from, toward the territories where her people might have been. He didn't speak. After a while, she returned to her pallet and lay down. In the morning, Jacob found marks carved into the wall near her bedding. Tally marks, counting days, or maybe counting something else. He didn't ask. By January, the isolation began pressing in. Jacob had always preferred solitude, but solitude with another person was different. It created a strange tension, like 2 animals sharing a den, wary and watchful, never fully at ease. He started talking, not to her, but aloud, narrating his tasks, explaining which wood burned best, describing the terrain beyond the valley. Talking helped fill the silence, made the cabin feel less like a tomb. The woman never responded. But she listened. He could tell by the way she paused in her work, the way her head tilted slightly toward him when he spoke. One afternoon, while Jacob was repairing a trap, the woman approached him and knelt beside the workbench. She watched his hands as he bent the steel, adjusted the spring, tested the trigger mechanism. Then she reached out and touched the trap, running her fingers over the teeth. Jacob froze. It was the first time she had initiated any interaction. She looked up at him, and for the first time, he saw something other than stone in her expression. He saw calculation. She was studying him, trying to determine what kind of man he was, whether the mercy he had shown by bringing her here was real, or just another form of cruelty waiting to reveal itself. Jacob set the trap down and stepped back, giving her space. The woman picked up the trap, examined it from every angle, then set it down and returned to her work. It was a small moment, but it shifted something between them. February brought a storm that lasted 6 days. Snow piled against the cabin walls until the windows were half buried. The wind howled without pause, a constant roar that made conversation impossible, even if they had wanted it. They were trapped inside. 2 people in a space built for one, with nothing to do but wait. Jacob maintained the fire. The woman cooked. They ate in shifts. They slept at different times. They moved around each other like dancers who had learned each other's patterns without ever practicing together. On the 4th day of the storm, supplies ran low. Jacob rationed the food carefully, giving the woman larger portions. She noticed but didn't argue. Hunger was something she understood, something she had likely known longer and deeper than he had. On the 6th day, the storm broke. Jacob dug them out, carving a tunnel through the snow that had drifted against the door. When he finally broke through, the sunlight was blinding, reflecting off an endless field of white. The woman stepped outside and stood in the clearing, her breath steaming in the frozen air. She looked at the mountains, the trees bent under the weight of snow, the sky scrubbed clean and impossibly blue. Then she looked at Jacob, and for the first time she spoke. Her voice was rough from disuse, the words halting and accented, but clear enough. She told him her name. Not the name Hutchins had used, but her real name. The name her mother had given her. Jacob nodded. He told her his name, though she probably already knew it from hearing him mutter to himself during the long winter. It wasn't much, just an exchange of names. But it was the first brick in a bridge neither of them had planned to build. March arrived with false promises of spring. The snow began to melt, then froze again, creating a crust thick enough to walk on, but treacherous enough to break through without warning. Jacob checked his trap lines and found more empty traps than full ones. The animals were emerging from their winter dens, moving to new territories, following the thaw. The woman began leaving the cabin during the day. At first, Jacob worried she was planning to run, but she always returned before dark, carrying handfuls of plants and roots he didn't recognize. She boiled them into teas and poultices, adding them to their meals, using them to treat a persistent cough Jacob had developed during the long freeze. The cough faded. His strength returned. He began to understand that she wasn't just surviving alongside him. She was keeping him alive. One morning, Jacob woke to find her gone. The pallet was empty, the blankets folded. Her few possessions were still there, so he knew she hadn't left permanently. But the cabin felt immediately wrong without her presence. He found her an hour later, half a mile from the cabin, kneeling beside a creek where the ice had melted enough to expose running water. She was washing something in the current, her hands red from the cold. Jacob approached slowly, making noise so she would hear him coming. She didn't turn around. She kept washing, rhythmic and focused. When Jacob got close enough, he saw what she was cleaning. A deerskin dress, intricately beaded, the kind of garment that took months to make. It had been hidden somewhere, buried perhaps, and she had dug it out now that the ground was thawing. She lifted it from the water and held it up to the light. The beadwork caught the sun, scattering small rainbows across the snow. Jacob understood then. This was who she had been before Hutchins, before the auction, before she became property. This dress represented a life that had been stolen. She folded the dress carefully and stood. She looked at Jacob, and in that look was a question she didn't ask aloud. Jacob nodded toward the cabin. She walked back with him, carrying the dress like it was made of glass. That night, she wore the dress. It fit her perfectly, the beadwork sitting just right across her shoulders, the fringe moving with each step. She looked different, not transformed but returned, like she was inhabiting her own skin again after a long absence. Jacob cooked that night, giving her space to simply exist in her reclaimed identity. They ate together at the table, and for the first time, it didn't feel like captor and captive. It felt like two people who had survived a long winter and were tentatively acknowledging each other's humanity. April turned the valley green. The snow retreated to the highest peaks. Wildflowers erupted across the meadows. Animals returned in numbers. Jacob's traps filled again. The smokehouse stocked up. The root cellar was replanted. The woman spent more time outside, gathering plants with purpose now, creating stores of her own. She built drying racks for herbs. She tanned hides using techniques Jacob didn't know. She sang sometimes, low songs in a language he didn't understand, songs that sounded like mourning and memory mixed together. Jacob began teaching her things he thought might help if she decided to leave. How to shoot the rifle. How to start a fire in wet conditions. How to read weather signs and animal tracks. She learned quickly, absorbing information with the intensity of someone who understood knowledge was survival. But she didn't leave. The passes were open now. The trails were passable. She could have walked away any morning and made it to her people before summer. She stayed. Jacob didn't ask why. He was afraid of the answer. Afraid she stayed because she felt she had no choice. Afraid she stayed because she had been broken by what had been done to her before he bought her. Afraid she stayed because freedom felt more dangerous than captivity. Or afraid she stayed because she had made the same calculation he had, the same grim arithmetic that said two people surviving together had better odds than one person surviving alone. By May, they had fallen into a partnership. Not spoken, not formalized, but real. They worked the land together. They hunted together. They defended the cabin together when a grizzly tried to break into the smokehouse, and when a pair of drifters approached looking for easy theft. The woman proved herself capable in ways that surprised Jacob, though he tried not to show his surprise. She tracked game as well as he did. She could read terrain and anticipate animal behavior. She understood the forest in ways that came from generations of knowledge, not from trial and error. Jacob began to rely on her, not as property, not even as a helper, as a partner. And that realization terrified him more than anything he had faced in the wilderness. Because relying on someone meant vulnerability. It meant attachment. It meant caring whether they lived or died. And Jacob had spent 6 years carefully constructing a life where he didn't care about anything or anyone. He had built his isolation deliberately, brick by brick, burying himself in the mountains to escape what he had been, what he had done, who he had failed to save. But now this woman, whose real name he spoke quietly in the privacy of his own thoughts, was dismantling that isolation simply by existing in his space, by working beside him, by trusting him enough to stay. Late May brought the first travelers of the season. 3 men on horseback, heavily armed, moving through the valley with the casual arrogance of people who believed they owned whatever they could take. Jacob spotted them from the ridge above the cabin. He watched them through his rifle scope, counting weapons, assessing threat level. They stopped at his cabin. One dismounted and kicked the door open. The other 2 stayed mounted, keeping watch. The woman was inside. Jacob had left her there while he checked the northern trap line. She was alone, and these men were the kind who saw isolated women as opportunities. Jacob moved fast, descending the ridge at a controlled run, keeping low, using the tree line for cover. By the time he reached the clearing, the men had dragged the woman outside. She fought, not wildly, but with calculated violence. She had learned from Jacob, had absorbed his lessons on where to strike, how to create openings, how to survive when outmatched. But 3 armed men were too many. Jacob shot the first man from 30 yards, center mass. The man dropped without a sound. The second man spun toward the gunshot, trying to locate the shooter. Jacob's second shot took him in the shoulder, spinning him around, dropping him to his knees. The third man grabbed the woman and pressed a knife to her throat. He shouted demands into the trees. He wanted safe passage. He wanted his horses. He wanted to leave alive. Jacob stepped into the clearing, rifle raised, aimed directly at the man's head. The man tightened his grip. The knife drew a thin line of blood. Jacob didn't lower his rifle. He didn't negotiate. He simply waited, watching the man's eyes, reading the calculations happening behind them. The man was weighing odds, deciding if killing the woman would buy him enough time to escape, deciding if Jacob was bluffing. Jacob wasn't bluffing. The man saw that. He lowered the knife. He released the woman and stepped back, hands raised. Jacob shot him anyway, not center mass, in the leg, dropping him but keeping him alive. The woman walked to where the second man was clutching his shoulder. She picked up his fallen revolver, checked the cylinder, aimed carefully, and shot him in the head. Then she walked to the third man, who was screaming on the ground, clutching his shattered femur. She stood over him, the revolver still raised. Jacob said her name, once, quietly. She looked at him. Her face was blank, the same stone mask she had worn on the auction platform. But her hands were shaking. Jacob walked over and gently took the revolver from her. He checked the wounded man's injuries. The femoral artery was intact. The man would live if he got help within a day or two. Jacob dragged all three men away from the cabin and tied them to trees. He gave them water but no food. He explained that they were 2 days from the nearest settlement. He explained that their horses would be released tomorrow and would likely find their way home. He explained that if they ever came back, he would kill them without warning and without hesitation. Then he and the woman went back inside the cabin. She sat at the table, her hands still trembling. Blood was drying on her neck where the knife had pressed. She stared at the wall, breathing slowly, processing what had just happened. Jacob cleaned her wound with whiskey and bandaged it with clean cloth. He made coffee and set a cup in front of her. She drank it mechanically. Neither of them spoke about what she had done. Neither of them needed to. On the frontier, killing in defense of your life was as natural as breathing. It didn't require justification or explanation. It simply was. But something had shifted. Again, another brick in the bridge. The woman looked at Jacob, and in her eyes was a question that had been building for months. Why hadn't he used her? Why hadn't he taken what he had paid for? Why had he treated her like a human being when everything she had experienced suggested she was not considered human by the men who looked like him? Jacob didn't have an answer that would satisfy that question. He barely had an answer for himself. He had bought her because seeing her on that platform had broken something inside him, had cracked open a door he had been keeping sealed for 6 years, had reminded him that once, a long time ago, he had been a different man who believed in different things. But he didn't say any of that. Instead, he told her about the war. He spoke for hours, his voice low and steady, recounting things he had never told anyone. He described battles in Missouri and Kansas. He described orders that made no sense in commanding officers who cared more about politics than soldiers. He described the transition from soldier to guerrilla, from guerrilla to outlaw, from outlaw to something without a name. He described a raid in eastern Colorado, winter of 1864, a village of Cheyenne camped along a frozen creek. He described how his unit had been told the village harbored hostiles, how they had been ordered to clear the area, how questions were not encouraged. He described the attack, the smoke, the screaming, the way the creek ran red. He described a woman who had tried to protect a child, how she had stood between the soldiers and a group of running figures, how she had refused to move even when shots were fired over her head. He described how one of his fellow soldiers had killed her, casually, without hesitation, and then killed the child. Jacob had stood there, rifle in hand, saying nothing, doing nothing. He described how he left the army 2 weeks later, how he headed west and kept going, how he built this cabin in this valley specifically because it was far from everyone and everything. He described how he had spent 6 years trying to forget that day, trying to bury it under physical labor and isolation, trying to become someone who didn't carry those memories. And then he described walking into Fort Benson and seeing a woman on an auction platform who stood exactly like that woman by the creek had stood, with the same refusal to break, the same dignity in the face of men who saw her as less than human. He told her he bought her because he couldn't save that other woman, and some broken part of him thought maybe saving this one would balance the scales. He told her he knew it didn't work that way, that redemption wasn't arithmetic, that some debts couldn't be repaid. But he had tried anyway. When he finished, the cabin was silent except for the crackling of the fire. The woman stood and walked to where Jacob sat. She placed one hand on his shoulder, a brief touch, then returned to her pallet. It was the first time she had touched him voluntarily. It was the first time she had offered comfort rather than just accepting it. Jacob sat at the table long into the night, staring at the fire, feeling the weight of confession settle over him like snow. June brought travelers, trappers heading into the high country, prospectors chasing rumors of gold, families in covered wagons pushing west toward Oregon and California. The valley wasn't on any major route, but it was close enough that people occasionally passed through, looking for game or water or simply a place to rest. Most travelers moved on quickly. Some stopped to trade. A few asked questions about the woman, their eyes calculating, their hands hovering near their weapons. Jacob made it clear she was under his protection. He made it clear in the way he stood, the way he kept his rifle close, the way he responded to certain looks with silence so cold it froze conversations. Word spread. The valley gained a reputation. The man in the chinked log cabin and the Indian woman who lived with him. Some called it scandalous. Some called it practical. Some called it something darker. Jacob didn't care what they called it. He cared that the woman felt safe. He cared that she could work outside without constantly watching the tree line. He cared that she had stopped sleeping with a knife under her blanket. But the attention brought risk. More people knowing about them meant more people who might decide to cause trouble, either out of moral outrage or simple greed. In late June, a marshal came through. He was young, maybe 25, wearing a badge that looked too new and a gun that looked too old. He was accompanied by a deputy, older and harder, with eyes that had seen things the marshal hadn't. They stopped at the cabin on a Tuesday afternoon. The marshal did the talking. He asked if Jacob was Jacob Cord. He asked about the woman. He asked if Jacob was aware of territorial laws regarding cohabitation with natives. Jacob listened without responding. He had dealt with law before, had learned that silence was often more powerful than argument. The marshal explained that there had been complaints. Travelers passing through had reported the situation. Questions had been raised about whether Jacob had legal ownership of the woman, whether she was being held against her will, whether the territorial government needed to intervene. Jacob asked who filed the complaints. The marshal wouldn't say. The deputy, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. He said the complaints came from a trader named Hutchins. He said Hutchins claimed Jacob had stolen property from him, had fled the fort without proper documentation, had violated the terms of sale. Jacob finally spoke. He said he had a bill of sale. He said the transaction was legal, according to the standards of the fort. He said if Hutchins had issues, Hutchins could come address them personally. The marshal looked uncomfortable. He clearly didn't want to be here, didn't want to be enforcing laws that everyone knew were corrupt, didn't want to be caught between a territorial government that profited from illegal trade and his own sense that what was legal wasn't necessarily right. The deputy had no such conflict. He asked to see the woman. He wanted to verify she was being treated according to the standards expected of property. Jacob refused. He said the woman was inside, and no one was going inside his cabin without invitation. The deputy's hand moved toward his gun. The marshal put a hand on the deputy's arm, stopping him. The marshal looked at Jacob for a long moment, reading him, trying to determine what kind of man he was dealing with. Then he asked a different question. He asked if the woman wanted to leave. Jacob stepped aside and called her name. The woman emerged from the cabin. She wore her beaded dress. She carried herself with the same dignity she had shown on the platform 9 months ago. The marshal asked her directly if she was being held against her will. She looked at Jacob, then she looked at the marshal. She said nothing. The deputy demanded an answer. He stepped forward, reaching for her arm. Jacob moved between them, his rifle coming up not quite to a threatening position but close enough to make the intent clear. The deputy backed down. The marshal sighed. He explained that without a statement from the woman, he couldn't determine whether intervention was necessary. He explained that if she later claimed she was being held captive, the territorial government would respond appropriately. Jacob nodded. He understood. The marshal was giving him a warning and an opportunity. The 2 lawmen rode away. Jacob and the woman watched them go. That night, Jacob explained what had happened, what the marshal's visit meant, what Hutchins was trying to do. He explained that Hutchins likely wanted her back, not out of any sense of ownership, but because Jacob had embarrassed him, had undermined the system Hutchins profited from. He explained that more men would come, maybe marshals, maybe bounty hunters, maybe Hutchins himself. He told her again that she could leave, that he would give her supplies, weapons, and directions to reach her people safely, that staying with him was becoming more dangerous, not less. The woman listened. Then she walked to the corner where Jacob kept his ammunition stores. She picked up a box of rifle cartridges, carried them to the table, and began loading magazines with practiced efficiency. Her answer was clear. July brought heat that turned the valley into a furnace. The creek ran low. Game became scarce. Jacob and the woman worked to maintain the garden they had planted in spring, hauling water from the creek in buckets, fighting off deer and elk that tried to raid the vegetables. They were sitting outside one evening, enjoying the brief coolness after sunset, when Jacob saw riders approaching from the south. 5 men, moving slowly, heavily armed. Jacob recognized the lead rider immediately, Hutchins. He was flanked by 4 men who looked like professional muscle, the kind hired in places where money mattered more than law. Jacob stood. The woman stood beside him. Hutchins reined up 50 feet from the cabin. He smiled, showing those missing teeth. He greeted Jacob like an old friend, his voice jovial and false. He explained that there had been a misunderstanding. He explained that the bill of sale from the auction was invalid due to a clerical error. He explained that the woman needed to return to the fort for proper processing. Jacob asked to see the documentation proving the sale was invalid. Hutchins said the documentation was being held by the territorial administrator. He said all Jacob needed to do was surrender the woman, and the matter would be resolved peacefully. Jacob said no. Hutchins stopped smiling. He said Jacob was making a mistake. He said resisting would result in charges of theft and harboring fugitive property. He said the 4 men with him were deputized and authorized to use necessary force. Jacob said they were welcome to try. The men behind Hutchins shifted in their saddles. Hands moved toward weapons. The woman spoke then, addressing Hutchins directly in English for the first time. Her voice was cold and clear. She told him she would die before going back. She told him Jacob would kill at least 3 of them before they could get close. She told him he needed to decide if reclaiming one woman was worth losing that many men. Hutchins stared at her, his face darkening. He hadn't expected her to speak, hadn't expected her to have a voice in this transaction. He turned to his men and gave a command. They dismounted, spreading out, creating a perimeter. Jacob and the woman backed toward the cabin. They had prepared for this. They had discussed what to do if men came in numbers. They had created sight lines, identified cover, stockpiled ammunition in strategic locations. The standoff lasted hours. The sun set. Darkness fell. Hutchins's men built a fire and settled in, making it clear they weren't leaving. Jacob and the woman took shifts watching through the cabin's gun ports, narrow openings designed specifically for defense. They had water, food, and ammunition. They could hold out for days if necessary. But Jacob knew Hutchins wouldn't wait days. He would attack at dawn, when light favored the attackers and exhaustion weakened the defenders. Jacob was right. The attack came with first light. 2 men approached from the front, using the trees for cover. 2 more circled around back. Hutchins stayed near the fire, directing the assault like a general managing a battle. The first shot came from the tree line. It hit the cabin wall 2 feet from a gun port, sending splinters flying. Jacob returned fire, aiming carefully, conserving ammunition. His shot hit one of the men in the arm, not fatal but enough to take him out of the fight. The woman fired from the back port, tracking movement in the brush. Her shot went high but forced the flanking men to take cover. The assault continued for 30 minutes. Bullets thudded into the log walls, windows shattered. The door took multiple hits, the wood splintering but holding. Jacob worked methodically, shooting when he had clear targets, reloading between shots, maintaining calm despite the chaos. The woman matched his rhythm, covering different angles, calling out positions. They wounded 2 more men. The assault faltered. Hutchins called for a ceasefire. He shouted that he was willing to negotiate, willing to walk away if Jacob paid compensation for the trouble. Jacob knew it was a lie. Hutchins couldn't walk away empty-handed. He would lose face, lose credibility, lose the fear that kept his business running. But the ceasefire bought time. Jacob and the woman used it to reload fully, to drink water, to assess their ammunition supply. They had maybe 2 hours of sustained fighting left before they ran out. After that, it would come down to revolvers and knives. Jacob told the woman that when the ammunition ran out, she should take river and run. He would hold the cabin, buy her time to escape. She refused. She said they survived together or died together. She said she had run before, and it had led to that platform at Fort Benson. She said she was done running. Jacob started to argue, but she cut him off. She reminded him of what he had told her about the Cheyenne woman by the creek. She said that woman had stood her ground. She said maybe standing ground mattered more than surviving. Before Jacob could respond, the second assault began. This time, Hutchins's men came with fire. They lit torches and threw them at the cabin, trying to ignite the sod roof, the wood walls, anything that would burn. The roof smoldered, but didn't catch. The logs were too green, too damp from recent rain. But smoke filled the cabin anyway. Jacob and the woman wrapped cloth around their faces and kept firing, their eyes streaming, their throats burning. One of Hutchins's men got close, made it to the door, tried to force it open. The woman shot him through the door, the bullet punching through wood and flesh. The man fell backward, screaming. His screams drew attention, made the other attackers hesitate. Hutchins yelled for them to finish it, to stop being cowards, to remember what they were being paid. But professional muscle only fights as long as the odds stay favorable. When defending turns out to be better armed and better prepared than expected, professionals reassess. 2 of Hutchins's men withdrew, disappearing into the trees, leaving Hutchins with only 1 healthy fighter. Hutchins saw his assault falling apart. He stood from cover, revolver in hand, and started walking toward the cabin himself, shouting about pride and authority and consequences. Jacob aimed carefully through the smoke and squeezed the trigger. The shot took Hutchins in the shoulder, spinning him around, dropping him to his knees. Not fatal. Jacob didn't want it to be fatal. He wanted Hutchins alive to carry a message back to the fort. The last healthy fighter ran. Just turned and sprinted for the horses, mounted up, and rode hard toward the south. The clearing fell quiet except for Hutchins's whimpering and the groans of the wounded scattered around the cabin. Jacob and the woman emerged cautiously, weapons ready, checking for threats. Hutchins lay on the ground, clutching his shoulder, blood seeping between his fingers. He looked up at Jacob with hate and fear mixed together. Jacob knelt beside him. He spoke quietly, making sure Hutchins understood every word. He said the woman was free. He said she had always been free. He said anyone who came looking for her again would die. He said this cabin, this valley, was now territory that carried a cost to enter. He said if Hutchins wanted to survive, he would spread that message. Make sure every trader, every marshal, every bounty hunter understood that the system of buying and selling human beings had at least one place it couldn't operate. Hutchins nodded, his face pale, his teeth chattering from shock. Jacob bandaged Hutchins well enough to survive the ride back to Fort Benson. He helped the other wounded men onto horses. He gave them water and jerky for the journey. Then he sent them away. When they were gone, Jacob and the woman stood in the clearing, surveying the damage. Bullet holes in the walls, shattered windows, burned patches on the ground, blood in the dirt. The cabin had held, they had held. The woman turned to Jacob and asked a question she had never asked before. She asked what happened now. Jacob didn't have an answer. They had won this fight, but there would be others. Word would spread about what happened here. Some people would respect the boundary they had established. Others would see it as a challenge. The frontier didn't forgive weakness, but it also didn't forgive anyone who disrupted the established order. Jacob and the woman had disrupted that order. They had made themselves targets. Jacob said they could leave. Find a different territory, a different valley, start over where no one knew them. The woman said running hadn't worked for her before. She said this place was the first place she had felt something close to peace since her village was destroyed. She said leaving meant giving Hutchins and men like him exactly what they wanted. Jacob understood. This cabin represented something now. Not just shelter, not just survival. It represented a line in the dirt, a place where the rules didn't apply, where man and woman could exist outside the brutal economy of the frontier. They spent the next week repairing the damage. New window glass salvaged from an abandoned claim 15 miles away. Wood patches over bullet holes. New furniture to replace what had been destroyed. August came. The valley bloomed with late summer wildflowers. The creek ran clear and cold. Life returned to its rhythms, but Jacob noticed changes in himself. He slept lighter. He watched the tree line more carefully. He kept weapons within reach at all times. The woman noticed too. She suggested they needed help, needed allies, needed to build connections with people who could provide warning if threats were coming. Jacob resisted at first. He had built his life around isolation. Connections meant obligations, meant caring, meant vulnerability. But the woman was right. Two people couldn't defend against determined assaults indefinitely. They needed information, needed to know when trouble was heading their way. So Jacob started making trips to the nearby settlements. Not the fort, never the fort again. But smaller trading posts in camps where news traveled and people talked. He learned that Hutchins had returned to Fort Benson and immediately left for California. The story was that he had been injured in an accident and decided to retire. But other stories circulated too. Stories about a cabin in the mountains where a man and woman had fought off a small army. Stories that might have been exaggerated but carried truth at their core. Jacob also learned something else. Something that made his blood run cold. 6 years ago, when his unit had raided that Cheyenne village, the woman who had tried to protect the children hadn't died. She had survived barely and had been sold into the same network that eventually led to Fort Benson. That woman was the same woman now living in Jacob's cabin. He had bought the woman whose life he had failed to defend. The universe had given him a chance at redemption, so direct it felt like a curse. Jacob stood in that trading post, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. Everything he had told himself about random chance, about trying to balance scales with a different person, about symbolic redemption, all of it was wrong. This was the exact same person, the woman by the creek. The woman he had watched die and done nothing to prevent, except she hadn't died. She had survived and suffered and ended up on a platform at Fort Benson 9 months ago. Jacob rode back to the cabin in a daze. He didn't know how to process what he had learned. He didn't know if the woman knew who he was, if she had recognized him when he bought her, If she had been waiting all these months for him to acknowledge what he had done, he arrived at the cabin after dark. The woman was sitting outside, working on a hide by firelight. She looked up when he approached, reading something in his expression. She asked what was wrong. Jacob dismounted and sat across the fire from her. He tried to speak several times, the words catching in his throat. Finally, he managed to ask if she remembered the raid. The creek, the village. The woman's hands stilled. Her face went blank, that stone mask returning. She said of course she remembered. She said she remembered every detail. The cold, the smoke. The way her sister's children had died while she could do nothing but watch. Jacob asked if she had known who he was when he bought her. She said yes. She had recognized him immediately. Had remembered his face from that day, standing among the soldiers, rifle in hand, watching. Jacob felt like he had been shot. She had known. All these months she had known, and she had stayed anyway. He asked why. The woman set down her work and looked at him directly. She said because on that day, while most soldiers had participated in the killing, Jacob had not. She said she had watched him, had seen him lower his rifle, had seen him turn away from the worst of it. She said he had been complicit by inaction, but he had not been enthusiastic. He had not enjoyed it. She said that when she saw him at the auction, she had expected him to use her the way men who bought women at auctions always used them. She said when he didn't, when he brought her to this cabin and gave her space and freedom, she realized he was a man carrying guilt. She said guilt made people dangerous or made them redeemable. She had stayed to discover which kind of guilt Jacob carried. She said she had decided months ago that his guilt was the redeemable kind. Jacob didn't know how to respond. He had spent 6 years running from that guilt, burying it, trying to forget. And here was the woman he had failed, telling him she had forgiven him, or at least decided he was worth not killing. He told her he didn't deserve forgiveness. He told her what he should have done that day, how he should have stopped it, or tried to stop it, or at least died trying. He told her that living with the guilt was his punishment, and it wasn't enough, would never be enough. The woman listened. Then she said something that changed everything. She said forgiveness wasn't about what he deserved. It was about what she needed to survive. She said carrying hate for every person who had harmed her, who had stood by while she was harmed, who had profited from systems that harmed her, that hate would consume her entirely. It would make her into something hollow and broken. She said choosing to see Jacob as redeemable wasn't mercy toward him. It was mercy toward herself. It was choosing to believe that people could change, could recognize their failures, could try to build something different. She said if she couldn't believe that, then there was no point in surviving at all. Jacob sat in silence, absorbing her words. He had spent 6 years focused on his own guilt, his own redemption. He hadn't considered that the woman might have her own reasons, her own calculations, her own survival strategies that had nothing to do with absolving him. She had stayed not because she forgave him, but because staying represented hope. Hope that the world could be different than it had been. Hope that men could learn. Hope that the future didn't have to replicate the past. That night, Jacob made a decision. He told the woman that he wanted to help her find her people, her real people. Whatever remained of her family, her tribe. He said he would use whatever resources he had, would travel wherever necessary, would risk whatever needed to be risked. He said it not because it would redeem him, but because it was what she deserved. The woman considered this. Then she said she had a different idea. She said she wanted to stay in the valley. She said she wanted to make this place into something more than just a cabin. She said she wanted to create a stop, a safe place for other people like her. People running from slavery, from violence, from systems that treated them as property. She said if Jacob truly wanted to do something useful with his guilt, he could help her build that. Jacob agreed. September brought the first frost. Jacob and the woman began expanding. They built a second cabin, smaller, designed as a way station for travelers. They stockpiled supplies. They established connections with settlements where people opposed the slave trade, where abolitionists and sympathizers operated quietly. Word spread carefully, through channels Jacob was only beginning to understand. The valley became known as a place you could reach if you were running. Not publicized, not advertised, but whispered about in the places where desperate people gathered information. The first refugee arrived in October. A man, mixed race, who had escaped from a mining camp in Idaho. He stayed 3 days, recovered his strength, and continued west. The second came in November. A woman with 2 children, running from a rancher who had bought her in Utah. She stayed 2 weeks, helping with winter preparations in exchange for safety. By December, the valley was operating as an unofficial station on an underground network Jacob had never known existed. People arrived, stayed briefly, and moved on. Some headed for Canada. Some headed for settlements in Oregon where communities protected runaways. Some headed for tribal lands where they had family or connections. Jacob and the woman managed it all. They provided food, shelter, medical care, and directions. They asked for no payment except that people pass the information forward. Let others know the valley existed. It was exhausting. It was dangerous. Every person who arrived represented risk. Marshals were actively hunting runaways now. Bounty hunters worked the territories. Posses formed to track down escaped property. But for the first time since the war, Jacob felt like he was doing something that mattered. Not redemption. He had given up on redemption, but purpose. Simple, clear purpose. The woman thrived. She connected with people in ways Jacob couldn't. She spoke multiple languages, understood cultural contexts, provided comfort and hope that Jacob's stoic pragmatism couldn't offer. She became the center of the operation while Jacob became the logistics, the muscle, the warning system. Winter set in hard. The valley became nearly inaccessible, which provided safety but also isolation. They sheltered 4 people through January, 5 through February. The cabins were crowded. Food ran low, tensions rose, but everyone survived. When spring came, the refugees moved on, and Jacob and the woman were left alone again. Except they weren't alone anymore, not really. They carried the stories of everyone who had passed through. They carried the responsibility of maintaining the network. They carried the knowledge that what they had built mattered. In March, trouble came. A marshal arrived with a federal warrant. Not for any specific person, but for the valley itself. The warrant authorized the marshal to search for fugitive property and to arrest anyone harboring such property. The marshal was an older man, probably in his 50s, with gray in his beard and scars on his hands. He approached the cabin alone, his deputy waiting at the tree line with rifles ready. Jacob met him in the clearing. The woman stayed inside but visible through the window. The marshal explained the situation. He said he knew what the valley had become. He said he had testimony from multiple sources about refugees passing through. He said he had authority to shut it down. But then he said something unexpected. He said he didn't want to shut it down. He said he had been a soldier once, had seen things that haunted him, had spent his life after the war trying to figure out how to live with what he had done. He said he understood what Jacob was trying to do here. He said the federal government didn't care about one cabin in Montana, didn't care about small-scale operations that didn't disrupt major economic interests. He said as long as Jacob kept things quiet, kept numbers low, and didn't attract too much attention, federal marshals would focus on bigger targets. But he said if Jacob made noise, if he became a symbol, if newspapers started writing about the valley, or if politicians started making speeches about it, then the government would have to respond. He said Jacob needed to decide if he wanted to actually help people, or if he wanted to be famous for helping people. Because he couldn't do both, Jacob understood. The marshal was offering a deal. Operate quietly, help individuals, stay out of the political spotlight, and the government would pretend not to notice. Make a stand, go public, try to change the system, and the government would crush him. Jacob took the deal. He thanked the marshal and watched him ride away. That night, The woman asked if Jacob regretted the decision. If part of him wanted to make that public stand, become a symbol, fight the system openly, Jacob said no. He said symbols were for people who wanted glory. He said he just wanted to help people survive. He said quiet, persistent work accomplished more than loud, dramatic gestures. The woman agreed. She said her people had learned that lesson long ago. She said survival was often about being invisible, about working beneath the notice of power, about building networks that official systems couldn't see. They continued through the spring and summer of their second year. More people passed through. The network expanded. They made connections with other stations, other people running similar operations. Jacob learned that what they were doing wasn't unique. Across the territories, people were building these hidden spaces, these pockets of resistance against the machinery of slavery and exploitation. It didn't feel revolutionary. It felt like basic human decency. But basic human decency was itself revolutionary in a system designed to deny it. In August, a young woman arrived who reminded Jacob of the woman who had been on the platform at Fort Benson. Same age, same bearing, same refusal to be broken. She stayed a week, healing from injuries sustained during her escape. The woman treated her wounds and gave her clothes and food for the journey ahead. Before the young woman left, she asked Jacob why he did this. Why he risked everything to help people he didn't know. Jacob looked at the woman, his partner now, his equal, the person who had survived what he had failed to prevent, and realized he finally had an answer. He said he did it because years ago, he had stood in a place where he could have helped and chose not to. He said he did it because he couldn't undo that failure, but he could prevent it from happening again. He said he did it because the woman standing beside him had decided he was worth not killing, and he needed to prove she had made the right choice. The young woman nodded, thanked them both, and continued north toward Canada. September brought the first signs of trouble. Rumors reached the valley that a new territorial governor had been appointed, a man who campaigned on law and order, on protecting property rights, on cracking down on lawlessness. Jacob knew what that meant. The informal arrangement with the marshal wouldn't survive a change in political leadership. The new governor would want to make examples, prove his authority. The woman suggested they consider leaving, finding a different location, starting over somewhere the political winds were more favorable. But Jacob had learned something over the past 2 years. Running didn't solve problems, it just moved them. He said they should stay, make the valley as secure as possible, prepare for raids, help as many people as they could before the hammer fell. The woman agreed. October brought the first patrol. Territorial militia. 20 men, sweeping through the region looking for fugitives and those who harbored them. Jacob spotted them from the ridge. He rode back to the cabin and told everyone there 3 refugees currently sheltering to hide in the root cellar. The cellar had been expanded and concealed specifically for this purpose. When the militia arrived, Jacob and the woman were alone, working on winter preparations, looking like an isolated homesteading couple. The militia captain questioned Jacob about travelers, about seeing anyone matching descriptions of wanted fugitives. Jacob lied easily, said they saw almost no one this far into the mountains. The captain searched the cabin, the smokehouse, the second structure. He found nothing suspicious. He warned Jacob to report any strangers and rode on. The refugees emerged from the cellar after dark. They left the next morning, taking different routes, separating to avoid creating patterns. The militia returned twice more before winter. Each time, Jacob and the woman repeated the process. Hide the refugees. Look innocent. Provide no information. It was exhausting. The constant vigilance, the knowledge that one mistake would destroy everything, the weight of other people's lives resting on their decisions. In December, on a night when they were alone again, the woman asked Jacob a question that had been building for months. She asked what happened when they got caught, not if, but when. Because eventually, they would slip up, someone would talk. The militia would arrive at the wrong time. The governor would send enough men that resistance became impossible. She asked what Jacob would do when that moment came. Jacob thought about it for a long time. He thought about the deal the marshal had offered, about staying quiet, about operating beneath notice. He thought about how they had followed that deal faithfully, and it hadn't been enough. He said when the moment came, when the choice was between betraying the people they were protecting or facing the consequences, he would choose the consequences. He said he had spent enough of his life choosing safety over principle. He said the war had taught him that survival without honor wasn't worth the cost. The woman nodded. She said she had made the same calculation. She said being captured again, being returned to a system that treated her as property, was worse than dying. She said if the militia came in force, she would fight until fighting was no longer possible. They sat in silence, having acknowledged what they both knew was coming. January came with brutal cold and deep snow. No one could travel. The valley was sealed off, and for a few weeks, Jacob and the woman had peace. They used the time to prepare. More ammunition. Better fortifications. Escape routes mapped and cleared. A plan for what to do if the worst happened. February brought a thaw. And with the thaw came riders, not militia, not bounty hunters. Federal marshals. 6 of them, with warrants for Jacob's arrest. Charges including harboring fugitive property, interfering with lawful commerce, and assault on federal officers. The charges were fabricated or exaggerated. The assault charge probably referred to the incident with Hutchins, which hadn't involved federal officers at all. But the charges didn't need to be accurate. They just needed to be legal justification for what was about to happen. The marshals surrounded the cabin. They called for Jacob to surrender peacefully, said he would receive a fair trial, said cooperation would be considered during sentencing. Jacob knew better. Fair trials didn't exist for people who disrupted the economic order. Cooperation meant betraying everyone who had passed through the valley. He stepped outside, hands visible, rifle left inside. He asked to speak with whoever was in charge. The lead marshal dismounted and approached. He was young, maybe 30, with the eager intensity of someone trying to build a career. Jacob asked what would happen to the woman if he surrendered. The marshal said she would be processed through the territorial court system. Depending on her status, she might be returned to her tribe or released to federal supervision. It was bureaucratic language that meant nothing. Jacob knew the woman would be sent back into the system, sold to someone else, lost in the machinery that had nearly destroyed her the first time. Jacob said he wouldn't surrender unless the marshal guaranteed the woman's freedom, guaranteed it in writing, witnessed by all 6 federal officers. The marshal refused. He said he had no authority to make such guarantees. He said property disposition was handled by the courts. Jacob asked for 24 hours to consider his options. The marshal gave him 12. Jacob went back inside. The woman was standing by the window, watching the marshals establish their perimeter. She said they could fight. They had ammunition, fortifications, higher ground. They could hold out for days, maybe weeks if supplies lasted. Jacob said fighting would accomplish nothing except getting them both killed. The marshals would eventually overwhelm them through numbers or by waiting for them to run out of food. The woman said then they should run. Take river and escape through the back route they had cleared. Head north to Canada, start over. Jacob considered it. They might make it. The marshals didn't know the terrain. Jacob and the woman could survive in the wilderness for months if necessary. But running meant abandoning the valley, abandoning the network, abandoning everyone who might need this place in the future. Jacob made a different proposal. He said he would surrender. He would take full responsibility for everything that had happened in the valley. He would testify that the woman had been held against her will, that she was a victim, that she had no knowledge of the refugees passing through. He said his testimony, combined with his guilty plea, would be enough to satisfy the territorial government. They wanted someone to prosecute, someone to make an example of. He would give them that. And in exchange, the woman would go free. Not legally, perhaps, but practically. Without evidence against her, without testimony linking her to the operation, the courts would have no choice but to release her. The woman rejected the plan immediately. She said it was suicide. She said once Jacob was in custody, once he testified, he would hang or spend the rest of his life in a territorial prison. Jacob said he knew. He said it was worth it. She asked how he could think dying was worth anything. Jacob said it was worth it because for the first time in his life, he would be making a choice that mattered. Not survival, not self-preservation, but a choice that protected someone else, that served something larger than himself. He said he had stood aside once while someone suffered. He wouldn't do it again. The woman argued. She said they should fight together or run together. She said his sacrifice was romantic nonsense that accomplished nothing except making him feel better about his guilt. Jacob said maybe she was right. Maybe it was selfish, just a different form of running. But it was the only choice he could make and still live with himself during whatever time he had left. They argued through the night. The 12-hour deadline approached. Finally, as dawn broke, the woman stopped arguing. She looked at Jacob with an expression he couldn't read. She said if he was determined to do this, she wanted something from him first. She wanted him to acknowledge that his sacrifice didn't erase what had happened at the creek. That playing the hero now didn't balance the scales. That his death, if it came to that, would be meaningful only if he died understanding he was still in debt. Jacob agreed. He said he would never stop being in debt. The best he could do was spend what little remained of his life trying to pay interest. The woman accepted that answer. At dawn, Jacob walked out of the cabin with his hands raised. He announced his surrender. He told the marshals he would cooperate fully, would provide testimony and evidence, would plead guilty to all charges. The lead marshal approached cautiously, expecting a trap. When he realized Jacob was sincere, he produced manacles and locked them around Jacob's wrists. The woman emerged from the cabin. The marshals moved to restrain her as well. Jacob stopped them. He recited his prepared testimony, establishing that the woman had been held captive, forced to work, given no choice in the refugees who passed through. He said it loudly enough that all 6 marshals heard every word. The lead marshal looked uncertain. He asked the woman to confirm Jacob's statement. The woman looked at Jacob. He nodded slightly. She confirmed the story. She said she had been a slave, a victim, had participated in nothing willingly. The marshal had no choice. Without evidence to contradict her claim, without testimony linking her to criminal activity, he couldn't arrest her. He told her she was free to go. The woman didn't move. She stood in the clearing, watching as the marshals prepared to transport Jacob back to the territorial capital. Before they left, Jacob spoke to her one last time. He told her where money was hidden in the cabin, enough to survive the winter and buy passage to wherever she wanted to go. He told her the names of people in the network who would help her. He told her to be careful, to stay invisible, to survive. He told her thank you for staying, for giving him a chance to become something other than what he had been, for teaching him that redemption wasn't about erasing the past but about building something different from the ruins. The woman said nothing. She watched as the marshals lifted Jacob onto a horse and tied his hands to the saddle horn. The group rode south. Jacob looked back once and saw the woman still standing there, motionless, silhouetted against the cabin. Then the trees closed in, and she was gone. The journey to the territorial capital took 5 days. Jacob was kept in manacles the entire time, sleeping on the ground, given minimal food and water. The marshals weren't cruel, but they weren't sympathetic either. He was cargo now, a prisoner being transported to face justice. They arrived in Helena on a Tuesday. Jacob was processed through the territorial jail, photographed, fingerprinted, logged into the system. He was placed in a cell with 3 other men, all awaiting trial for various crimes. The trial itself was swift. The territorial government wanted to make an example, wanted to demonstrate that harboring fugitives carried serious consequences. Jacob's lawyer, appointed by the court, advised him to plead guilty and hope for mercy. Jacob pled guilty to all charges. He provided detailed testimony about the operation in the valley, about the number of people who had passed through, about the network that stretched across the territories. He named no names. He provided no information that would endanger anyone else. He took full responsibility, claimed sole agency in every decision. The prosecutor pushed for the death penalty. He argued that Jacob's crimes undermined territorial law, threatened public safety, and encouraged others to break federal statutes. The judge was older, probably 60, with the tired eyes of someone who had presided over too many cases like this. He listened to testimony, reviewed evidence, and took 3 days to render a verdict. He sentenced Jacob to life imprisonment at the Territorial Penitentiary, with no possibility of parole. It was more mercy than Jacob expected. Death would have been easier, cleaner. Life in prison meant years of slow decay, meant watching himself deteriorate in a concrete cell, meant time to think about everything he had lost and everyone he had failed. But it also meant the woman was free. The court had released her, determined she had no culpability. She had disappeared before the trial even began, melting back into the territories, invisible once again. Jacob was transported to the penitentiary in October, shackled in the back of a prison wagon with 5 other convicts. The facility was located in the southwest corner of Montana, a stone fortress surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. Life inside was exactly what Jacob expected. Small cell, hard labor during the day, minimal food, brutal guards. Prisoners survived by forming alliances or by becoming invisible. Jacob chose invisibility. He worked without complaint. He followed rules. He avoided conflict. He existed in that liminal space where the guards forgot about him, and other prisoners didn't see him as threat or opportunity. Winter passed. Spring came. Jacob fell into the rhythm of prison, the endless repetition of days that blurred together into gray sameness. He thought about the woman constantly, wondered where she had gone, if she had made it to Canada, if she had found her people. Wondered if she ever thought about the valley, about what they had built together. He hoped she didn't. He hoped she had moved forward, built a new life, left behind the trauma and the memories. In June, a new prisoner arrived. Young man, maybe 25, arrested for helping a family of runaways reach Oregon. He had heard about Jacob, had heard about the valley, had been inspired by the story to start his own operation. He told Jacob that the network was still operating. Different locations, different people, but the same purpose. He said Jacob's trial and imprisonment had become a rallying point, a reminder that the work mattered enough that the government needed to crush it. Jacob told the young man to forget about him, to focus on surviving his sentence, to leave the network alone once he was released. The young man said he couldn't do that. He said too many people needed help. He said someone had to stand against the system. Jacob recognized that certainty, that righteousness. He had carried it himself once, before the war taught him that righteousness without humility was just another form of violence. He told the young man to be careful, to stay quiet, to help individuals rather than trying to change the world. He said grand gestures got people killed. The young man didn't listen. 3 months later, he was killed in a prison riot, stabbed by another inmate who had been paid by someone on the outside who wanted to send a message. Jacob attended the burial, such as it was. A hole in the prison cemetery, a wooden marker with a number instead of a name. He stood there afterward, thinking about how many people had died trying to do the right thing, how little impact their death seemed to make, how the machinery of oppression ground forward regardless. But then he thought about the woman, about how she had survived, how she was still out there somewhere, living proof that resistance mattered, that small acts of defiance accumulated into something larger. Years passed. Jacob aged in prison, his hair grayed, his body weakened. He developed a persistent cough that never quite went away. The prison doctor said it was probably consumption, said Jacob had maybe 5 years left if he was lucky. Jacob didn't feel unlucky. He had lived longer than he deserved. He had paid some small fraction of his debt. He had done something that mattered, even if it ended here. In his 10th year of imprisonment, Jacob received a visitor. The guards brought him to the visiting room, a bare concrete space with a table and 2 chairs. The visitor was a woman. She was older now, probably in her 40s, wearing settler clothing and carrying herself with the confidence of someone who had found solid ground. It took Jacob a moment to recognize her. Then everything clicked into place. She sat across from him and smiled slightly, that same expression she had worn in the cabin when she was acknowledging something ironic. She told Jacob she had gone to Canada initially, had found distant relatives there, had lived with them for 3 years. But she had eventually returned to Montana, to a settlement that welcomed native families, where she had married and raised children and built a life. She said she had followed his story, had heard about the trial and the sentence. She said she had waited years to visit, wanting to make sure her presence wouldn't endanger herself or the network that continued operating. She said she came now because Jacob needed to know that what he did mattered, that the valley was still remembered, that people still whispered about the place where a white man had chosen to stand against the system, had chosen a native woman's freedom over his own. She said his sacrifice had inspired others. Not in grand, dramatic ways, but in small moments. People making different choices, people extending help, people refusing to participate in the machinery that crushed human beings. She said she wanted him to know that before he died, because people who gave up everything deserved to know their sacrifice wasn't wasted. Jacob asked about her life, her family. Whether she was happy. She said happiness was complicated. She carried trauma that would never fully heal. She had dreams about the creek, about the auction platform, about violence she couldn't prevent or escape, but she also had children who were free. She had a home that no one could take from her. She had built something that mattered from the ruins of what had been stolen. She said that was enough. They talked for an hour. When the guard announced time was up, the woman stood and placed one hand on Jacob's shoulder, just as she had done years ago in the cabin. She said one final thing before she left. She said Jacob's guilt had been useful, but he needed to let it go now. He had paid what could be paid. The rest was between him and whatever he believed about justice and the universe. She said she forgave him. Not because he deserved forgiveness, but because she was choosing to release them both from the weight of that day by the creek. Then she left. Jacob sat in the visiting room for a long time after, processing what she had said. The guard eventually came to retrieve him, led him back to his cell. That night, Jacob lay on his bunk and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not happiness, not peace, but something close to acceptance. He had done what he could. He had tried to balance scales that could never be truly balanced. He had chosen, in the end, to value someone else's life over his own. It wasn't redemption. It would never be redemption. But it was something. Jacob died 3 years later, in the winter of 1883, from complications of consumption. The prison recorded his death, logged his personal effects, there were none, and buried him in the cemetery alongside hundreds of other forgotten men. No marker. No ceremony. Just another body in the ground. But in the territories, in the settlements where people gathered and stories were told, the story persisted. The story of a man who bought a woman as a slave and then gave his life to free her. The details changed with each telling. Some versions made Jacob more heroic, some made him more villainous. Some focused on the woman, on her survival and strength. Some focused on the valley, on the network, on the small acts of resistance that accumulated into something larger. But the core remained constant. A man who had failed once had been given an impossible second chance. He had taken that chance and turned it into something that mattered. Not redemption. Never redemption. The dead couldn't be brought back. The suffering couldn't be undone. The systems that enabled horror continued grinding forward. But one woman was free, and that freedom had cost everything a man could give. In the end, that was all the story needed to be. Not a moral lesson, Not a tale of salvation. Just a record of choice, of sacrifice, of someone deciding that another person's life mattered more than his own. The frontier had been built on opposite choices, on seeing other people as obstacles or opportunities, on taking what could be taken without regard for cost. Jacob's choice hadn't changed the frontier, but it had proven that different choices were possible. And in a world that seemed determined to crush that possibility, proving it existed mattered. The woman lived another 30 years after Jacob's death. She raised her children. She told them stories about their heritage, about their people, about survival and resistance. She never spoke about the cabin or the valley, protecting those who still operated the network. When she died in 1913, she was surrounded by family, in a home that belonged to her, in a life she had built from ashes. Her children buried her according to traditional customs, in a place of honor, with ceremonies that connected her to the generations that had come before and would come after. They didn't know about Jacob. She had never told them the full story of how she had survived, how she had been bought and freed, how a man had traded his life for hers. But on the day of her burial, her oldest daughter found a small wooden box among her mother's belongings. Inside was a single item, a bill of sale dated 1868, documenting the purchase of human property at Fort Benson, Montana Territory. The daughter read it, confused at first, then understanding slowly dawning. She took the paper outside and burned it, watching the smoke rise and dissipate into the mountain air. Some debts were never meant to be kept. Some records were better destroyed than preserved. Her mother had been free. That was what mattered. Everything else was history, and history belonged to the dead. The living had their own battles to fight, their own choices to make, their own lines to draw in the dirt. And somewhere in those choices, in those battles, in those lines, Jacob's sacrifice echoed forward, not loud, not obvious, but present nonetheless. A reminder that even in the darkest corners of the frontier, even in systems designed to strip away humanity, people could choose differently. And sometimes that choice made all the difference.
Thanks for watching this story till the end. Comment below and tell me where you're watching from. And before you go, check out these other amazing Western stories waiting for you next. Subscribe, like, and I'll see you on the next ride.